The remesh format is sort of in between the static topology of multi-res and the dynamic topology of dynamic topology, which we'll see next. And a remesh can be a very powerful workflow for sculptors. I've seen artists use it to great effect. The first thing I want to clarify about remesh, unlike I said in the previous video where multi-res is a modifier and the other two formats are limited to sculpt mode, that's not true of remesh. Actually, remesh settings are embedded in every mesh object, which we can find in the object data under remesh. So it's very possible to perform a remesh operation in object mode instead of sculpt mode. In fact, when we jump into sculpt mode, these remesh settings here are simply sourced from the mesh data. The only difference is that there's a quad remesh option in the object data that is not available in sculpt mode. I'm not really sure why, but we will come back to that quad remesh. So let's talk about the core functionality of remesh. Let's see, I'll switch to the sculpting workspace. Got to drag out that toolbox again. And I want to enable our wireframe just to see what's happening. So in our remesh options, if we click the button with default settings, you'll see it sort of resembles a linear subdivision where we're increasing the amount of topology but maintaining the shape. And so for a cube, it maintains our shape perfectly, but we're rarely sculpting on a cube shape. So let's choose our mesh filter. Where is that? Here it is. And change the filter type to smooth, click and drag, so that we get more of an organic shape. And when we remesh at this point, we'll see a more typical type of remesh topology. And what's nice about remesh topology is that it is quadded. Quads generally provide a smoother sculpting experience than triangles, but it is a curious type of topology, notably with these kind of random edge loops at the corners. But in the cardinal directions, like the x-axis, the z-axis, the y-axis, it's the most consistent quadded topology. So how I've described this in the past is imagine you have several Spider-Men around the scene and they're all shooting webs at this object. And where those webs intersect, it kind of stitches together that topology. And the whole point is that we can sort of reset our topology with a more consistent or more dense wireframe. So if we go to the classic example of taking the snake hook and we drag out a tentacle shape, as you've seen before, we quickly run out of geometry and we get a horrible polygonal mess. If I remesh, which by the way, you can hit Control R in the viewport instead of hitting the button, Control R. According to the voxel size that we use, it will try to maintain the shape and provide new topology. I'm going to undo that because clearly we have a separation in the mesh. So I need to lower this voxel size to like 0.05. We'll cut it in half, Control R, and we actually still get a little bit of separation. I don't think there's a clean up option for this. Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any like delete detached parts of the mesh. So we could jump into edit mode and quickly delete that if we wanted. It's not ideal when that happens, but going back to the point, now this tentacle all of a sudden has enough geometry to form into something useful. And that is really the whole concept of remeshing. As you progress through your sculpture and you achieve your shapes, you can reset your topology as needed. One important hotkey in the remesh workflow is the R hotkey. If you press that, you'll get a grid in the viewport, which helps you determine a good voxel size for your remesh operations. That's a lot more intuitive than clicking on the menu and choosing a random value every time. So I think I need to get into more of a practical example in order to showcase these settings. So let's undo until before we pulled out the snake hook brush. One thing I do want to mention real quick in the settings, I'm going to duplicate this object to show that whenever we remesh with this fix pole settings disabled, that's the default. So Control R to remesh. Remember, we get those kind of odd edge loops, or face loops rather. And this can create some very ridged results, but if we enable fixed poles, actually need to switch Alt Q to this other cube because our remesh settings are object specific. Remember, they're embedded into the object data. And so I've enable fixed poles here, Control R to remesh, and we don't get those ridges, and it's a much better result. So I highly recommend that you keep fixed poles on. I don't know why you would ever want this, to be honest. All right, let's delete this object. and continue on with a practical example. Let's say I want to turn this into an octopus type character. Once again, we will use the snake hook to pull out the tentacles on the bottom, the arms rather. Let's enable symmetry because that's absolutely fine here. So we'll pull out a couple of these tentacles, and right away I'm going to want to remesh to be able to sculpt on these tentacles. Control R. And now we have consistent topology where I can polish up these shapes. Let's see, kind of give it a little bit of a curl. Control R, remesh again. And so as the workflow progresses, it's very powerful to find your broad shapes and remesh as often as you need. Now, what this means for the workflow is you don't want to commit to details too early, or honestly, maybe not at all. You want to be very careful with details. So for example, if we undo that, and let's say I wanted to start the character by sculpting a face. All right, let's go down to, let's say 0.02. I'm going to need more voxels here. Control R to remesh. Let's turn off our wireframe. So let's say I start with the face and we just give it a little bit of a smile. I know I want my character to have a nice little friendly smile. All right, so we've added the smile. Excellent. I also know I want to have octopus arms. So we switch over to the snake hook and repeat what we just did. We pull out a couple legs. Now at this higher resolution, it's not too bad in terms of how far we've stretched the geometry, but I want to add, suckers to these arms. So I need to remesh to make sure I have that consistent geometry. Control R to remesh. And oh no, my smile is kind of blurry now. It's lost that firm shape that I achieved. And so I would have to kind of resculpt that each time I remeshed. And so that's where remesh is a problem. If you commit to details too early, the remesh operation is going to obliterate anything you commit to. And so my recommendation is to remesh earlier in your workflow. And once you're ready to commit to details, you want to stop using remesh. Now, one thing that remesh is pretty good at is kind of merging and welding multiple objects together. So let's say I wanted to add some antennas to this creature, and they would be pretty small compared to the rest of the body. So doing that with a snake hook brush is going to be a little bit cumbersome. It would be easier to just jump into object mode, add a mesh UV sphere, tab into edit mode, E to extrude straight down, and then kind of scale this object, place it on the head of our character. There we go. We've got this kind of antenna. I can merge these two or join them, Shift select the other object, Control J, and now they are one object, but they're separate mesh islands. And if we jump into sculpt mode, turn off our wireframe and hit Control R, that antenna is beautifully incorporated into the new mesh. And so that's an effective way if you wanted to kind of build each tentacle separately in object mode, or you're creating a human character and build out the pose in segments. You can remesh into one object. And so under symmetry, we can symmetrize from positive X to negative X to get that other antenna. And that's a very rudimentary overview of a remesh workflow. So at this point, if I want to start adding like a face and eyes, we'll just kind of inflate out a couple of eyes and then add a lid. Quickly I realized there's not enough geometry to add the kind of sharpness to the creases that I want. I can't really form the eyelid super well, so I need more geometry. So we go to remesh, we take the voxel size even less to 0.01, remesh, and that's going to take a few seconds because we're dealing with a lot of geometry now. We're up to basically 250,000 verts, and I have maybe enough to get the shapes that I want. It's still, not great the closer I get, but if I keep remeshing, it's a global increase of topology. And so these tentacles, which don't need the extra topology, get it anyway. And that's kind of a problem. If you want to sculpt details with remesh, you're going to go really high in your poly count. So a way that people remedy this is by sculpting in separate pieces. So you could take the arms and keep them separate from the body and, make it a stylistic choice to have that kind of harsh transition. And then you can have individual remesh operations per object. But I say that you can't localize detail, meaning I can't have more topology for the face and less for the arms. But remesh tries to give us a solution to this. If I turn on our wireframe, under remesh, we have adaptability. By default, it's set to 0, which is essentially off. If we change that to 0.05 and remesh, it's going to try and localize detail so that the face gets a little bit more, or specifically the details in the face get a little bit more, and then our broad, smooth shapes get less geometry. The problem with this, as you can see, is it's not consistent. You know, some parts of the face, even though this is a symmetrical mesh, this side got broad topology, this side gets random patches of high resolution topology. Same thing with our legs. So it's just kind of a mess, and the result is too messy to be practical. So I really don't recommend the adaptivity setting, but it's a thought that counts type of parameter. Let's quickly go through our other settings like preserve volume and attributes. So volume is a little hard to show, and what I think it's doing, if I pull out another snake hook, let's see, I'm going to remesh actually at 0.01, give a lot of geometry to our sculpture, and try and pull out a really thin little tentacle to demonstrate. And so I'll pull it out and it's pretty skinny. And if I remesh, let's go up a little bit to like 0.02. I'm going to duplicate this. And I'm going to remesh this one with volume off. Let's remesh it. And then this one, Alt-Q, make it active with volume on, remesh. So it might be hard to tell, but I think that this tentacle on the left shrunk ever so slightly in the remesh operation, whereas this one on the right tried harder to maintain its volume and thickness. So I think my recommendation would be to keep that on at all times. Same with attributes. So what attributes is trying to do is if I have any paint, for example, let's take our paintbrush, let's give it a random smiley face over here. Whenever I remesh, let's go up to 0.03. It's going to try and maintain that paint because it lives in our object data along with other attributes. So that's a color attribute, but we also have UVs, which, you know, let's just experiment with that to see how well remesh maintains UVs. My guess is it's not very well. So let's tab into edit mode, select everything, U, unwrap, smart project, just to get, you know, whatever UVs. And now when I jump back to sculpt mode and let's see, where are the remesh settings? Remesh, let's go down to 0.02, remesh. See what it did with the UVs, tab into edit mode. Yeah, so you can see kind of the leftover islands from the unwrap procedure, but you know, they're a mess, let's be honest. This is not really usable. So it's another thought that counts setting to be able to maintain your attributes. But realistically, you should not be remeshing if you've got attributes like UVs. So the last thing I wanted to show you about remesh, trying to merge these windows, there we go, is I mentioned early on that in our object data remesh settings, there is a quad option. And so this is called quadraflow remesh. And if we click that, we get a lot more options. If we just stick with the default, we'll get a little timeline because this takes some additional calculation. But what it's trying to do is an automated, clean topology that a human would try to achieve. So it's never going to be perfect, but it's certainly a lot more human-ish than the regular remesh. So it's nice that we have this, but as with most tools like this and other packages, it rarely creates a perfect mesh. So it's not something I use very much, maybe in a quick and dirty situation. But it is there, so play with it. And that's going to be it for our overview of the remesh format. Next, we'll look at dynamic topology.